What is the Big GP Consultation? In this episode, I'm joined by a team who've been basically working around this whole concept of trying to improve things in general practice and understanding how that's going to work for the benefit of the profession and our patients. And in this episode, they're going to explain what the Big GP Consultation is and how it's going to affect you out in primary care. Let's take enhance your primary care. Hello, EGP learners, and welcome to this episode. We're talking about the Big GP Consultation, and I'm really proud to be joined by the team from the group that looking at this. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because, as you all know, I'm awful at doing that for most things. I'm going to pass over first of all to Davina and then to Liam. So, Davina, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Gandalf, for having us today, and hello everyone out there. So, my name's Davina. I'm a GPST3, and I work in London. And hand it over to Liam.
Excellent, and great to be able to join you this evening. I'm Liam, I'm a GP trainee and I'm based in Cambridge. I'm just finishing my ST2 year.
Awesome. So I know you both have been taking the past year out to work on a fellowship and basically looking at this project, which has become the Big GP Consultation. What is it?
That's a very good question. Before we jump into the what, I think it's really important to talk about the why. Why did we set up the Big GP Consultation? So Davina and I met through our fellowship post. We were on the National Medical Directors Fellowship for the past 12 months. We've just recently finished. And through that, we met a number of other people, GP trainees, some secondary care trainees, who were all very interested in primary care and specifically general practice and what that future looks like. So we wanted to come together as a group of the next generation of GPs to think about what that future of general practice looks like, what is a positive future, and what steps can we take to get there. And we specifically wanted to do that separate from our fellowship roles and separate from the organisations that we were attached to in order to be independent, in order to listen to other people and really amplify what we heard from our participants. So in terms of specifically why did we set up the Big GP Consultation, there's a real feeling amongst our generation that I guess the voice of GP trainees and even the voice of early career GPs is quite often not heard when we're designing the future of general practice. So we don't often sit at policy making tables, whether that be locally, regionally, or even nationally, for example. And I guess there is a feeling that the people who do sit at the policy making tables are approaching the end of their career. They bring a whole load of experience, but we think there's a bit of a risk that they design a system that works perfectly for them just as they're about to retire. And it might not necessarily work as well for the people who are just coming through, potentially spending 30 or 40 years within general practice. So by not engaging the next generation of our GP workforce, I think we really risk missing out on some crucial insight into the challenges we face. Some really good ideas on how we can solve those problems that we do face. And then finally, engagement as well. So how can we bring this generation with us in order to create a positive vision for the future? What we wanted to do was really get out there to GP trainees, to early career GPs and ask them this question. What does a positive vision look like for the future of general practice? And how can we get there? And then really wrap all of that up and hand back what we found to our participants, but also to our policymakers locally, regionally, and nationally. That's the why. You might ask, how did we do this? I'm going to Davina to talk us through the how.
Thanks, Liam. So how do we actually do this? So we held 5 90-minute sessions on Zoom, and it was between February and May this year. And we covered a core theme relating to the future of general practice every month. So this included how clinical care is evolving, how we recruit, develop and retain our workforce, and the role we play in society. The participants was comprised an even split between GP trainees and early career GPs in all the sessions. And what we did was we invited expert speakers to open the sessions, and they shared their insights on the topical issues in general practice. So some of the speakers we had included Dr. Nikki Kanani, Dr. Mayo Lakani, Professor Dame Helen Stokes-Lampard, Dr. Bola Awolabi, and Professor Martin Marshall. So our participants then joined facilitated breakout rooms across the range of themes. and they were able to self-select which room to join based on their own interest, and these breakout rooms were facilitated by members of the Big GP Consultation team. So prior and post each session, the participants were sent a survey to share their initial ideas on the topic, and then any further thoughts afterwards. The discussions from each session were captured by our team who are facilitating the breakout rooms, and then we would present the discussion in the form of infographics and short reports, which you can find on our website. The reports, coupled with infographics, provided the additional information and the rich discussions within the breakout rooms. So the 5 session outputs covered included the role of GPs in integrated care systems, how do we best prepare the next generation of GPs, how do we most effectively recruit and retain our workforce, GPs in the bigger picture, covering topics like health inequalities, primary-secondary care interface, greener practice, and holistic medicine. And then subsequently, we collated all of this insight into one final report, which was launched on the 1st of September. So I can see Liam holding up our report. So please do check out the website. You can see all the rich discussions and the summary of the themes on our reports.
So with that report and the kind of process that you went through, what did you learn from that whole experience? You know, what would you say was some of the key messages that you came across from hearing from people?
So I think that's a really good question, and that's almost twofold. So there's the specifics within each of the sections that we talk about in the report, but then there's something beyond that as well. Those high level themes that we picked out from the conversations. So I guess one of the big things that we found from our generation was actually a real desire to work collaboratively. They recognise that the challenges we face within general practice at the moment are so substantial that it's going to be very hard for us alone to fix them. What does that mean in practice? They spoke quite favourably about working with other organisations, whether that be other practices in our PCN or other organisations within our integrated care systems, for example. They also spoke very positively about working collaboratively within the practice. So recognising that long gone are the days where general practice is just made up of GPs, and actually now we have a rich, diverse, multidisciplinary team. Our participants actually spoke quite favourably about that as well, and they felt that was a positive direction for the future. On almost both of those points, they do recognise that there are challenges with those as well, and there are things that how we could be more effective in how we're implementing that actually on the ground. And that might be something we pick up a bit later. And then I think the final sort of overarching theme was a real openness to sort of new ways of working, almost, again, a recognition that we're under quite a lot of pressure at the moment. Things aren't necessarily working in the way that we would like, and actually bringing a whole load of new ideas to the table about how we might be more effective in what we're doing, or how we might think differently in order to build a more positive future for general practice. And then I guess beyond that, it's into the specifics of the report almost.
And I guess
I know Liam.
Go for it, Davina. No, it's fine.
No, I said Liam touched on a really important part about team-based continuity approach. And many of our participants wanted to move towards this when delivering their care, and they were very positive about working with the multidisciplinary team and additional roles. However, they did find that they felt that they didn't really understand their roles and sometimes how to supervise or work alongside them, and they just wanted more support during training. So when they go out into practice and they have to supervise and mentor them, they know how to. And it was also mentioned, if all the sort of complex cases go to the GP because the simple cases have gone to the additional role supporting us, is 10-minute appointments really feasible? And sometimes these simple cases for the GP was how they caught up within their clinic times. So it became this whole vicious cycle of them mentioning it leads to burnout. So there were very pertinent points that sort of Liam briefly touched upon there, but team-based continuity of care was very well supported amongst our participants, and the concept of the continuity of care. And many participants actually described that as a cornerstone of general practice, and why majority of the participants actually went into general practice because of this continuity of care.
So I can pick on some of that. So you talked about team-based continuity of care. Some people may not have heard of that concept and stuff. Can you give us a bit more detail as to how that kind of worked within the practices that you experienced, and I guess pros and cons that were experienced?
Yeah, so various additional roles we've been working alongside, for example, social prescribers, pharmacists, paramedics within my practice, for example, we have all of them have been doing an amazing job in supporting us because the workload is huge right now, and working together has been very beneficial. But it's the fact of sometimes GPs are expected to supervise and mentor them, or when they come into the clinic room whilst you're consulting, sign some of their prescriptions, but you may not have actually seen their patients. So they just want that additional support initially when they do go out in general practice, that they know how to manage these types of situations and understanding those roles better. So if we want to, let's say, refer to the social prescriber, knowing their roles and remits within the practice and making sure they don't bounce it back to the GP, adding more workload to ourselves.
And I think there's a real point in there about how does that relate to continuity. So I think participants actually spoke very clearly that the days that maybe are long gone where you'd have one GP on call 24/7 for all of their patients, that's simply not sustainable in our modern healthcare system. So the idea of one GP who can do everything is probably not the way forward. But alongside that, they recognise how important continuity of care is for outcomes and also for satisfaction, and therefore moving away from an individual GP and more towards a team-based continuity of care. So that might be for one clinical problem, for example, you might see your GP and you might see the same GP, but also the same pharmacist. And also if it's an MSK problem, you might also see the same physio. And ideally, it would be great if that's the same for the same clinical problem, but also the same through your journey, through your life course almost. And you build relationships with one GP, one pharmacist, one physio, providing that you stay at that same practice. And that was felt to be a really powerful way to offer continuity of care and the benefits that it brings, and do so in a sustainable way.
And that fits really nicely with going further on the concept of continuity, personalised care and holistic medicine. Because once you've seen the same patient for a long period of time, you can really concentrate on the patient. You know them individually, because not one size fits all. It's not about sticking classes on certain conditions. So the concept of personalised care is exercised with continuity of care.
Cool. So I know one of the comments we often have in general practice, because it's so busy, is how can you do some of the other stuff around the practice, that may have real benefit with the patients, and you talked about one of the sections being the GP and the wider community. What kind of learning did you have from the experiences that people had, and more importantly, what are they thinking moving forward? Obviously, PCNs form a huge chunk of that, and we're partway through PCNs in their contract and all that kind of stuff. I'm curious to know what people were thinking, really.
I'm happy to take that one. So as we sort of touched upon, people are really favourable about working collaboratively. So working with the practices that we work alongside in order to meet some of these issues head on. However, in order to do so in practice, they felt we need a bit more than what we have available currently. So firstly, people felt, as a very basic starting point, we need to understand the structures that we're working within in order to know how to impact upon them. So our participants felt they would like more education on what a PCN is, who are the key players locally, and how does that relate to our ICS, so to better understand them. Secondly, they spoke really strongly about representation within some of these structures, particularly as we get more close to the ICB, ICS type structure, making sure there's a strong general practice and primary care voice, recognizing that we see the majority of consultations within primary care. And thirdly, in order to actually impact change, you need to know a bit about how to lead change and how to manage change. And one key theme we'll probably speak more about later is that leadership and management is almost core to the role of the modern day GP. Many GPs are doing this each and every day, whether they realize it or not, but it's not necessarily something that features heavily in our training. And then finally, once you've got all of these, you also need the time and the headspace in order to do it. And at the moment, I don't know about you, Gandhi, but we see in practice how snowed under people feel with the day-to-day workload, the urgent in-your-face workload. It's very hard to sort of take a step back from that and look at the bigger picture when the here and now is so present. So I guess people were very favourable, but in order to actually impact within and beyond our practice, we do need to understand these structures. We need to be represented within them. We need to know how to do some of this leadership stuff effectively and also have that time and headspace in order to do it.
So if we talk about that leadership and management side of stuff, obviously, if you go back 20 years ago, the progression of a GP career was classically GP training, locum for a bit, salaried, partner, and then that would be it for the rest of your career typically. We know that that's not how careers work nowadays, and actually we're seeing complete changings and obviously the creation of or the formalization of the portfolio GP role in particular. But with leadership and management, that can form kind of like an interesting complexity, because often you need a base place for people to understand how that role works and stuff. So what learning did you have with the leadership and management side of things, particularly for those moving forward in the new world of general practice? In particular, obviously we've got ICBs, PCNs, loads of other acronyms that I'm probably going to get told off if I start talking about. So yeah, take it from there.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked, Andy, because this was something that came out really strongly within this. And I'm going to start with an overarching theme that was early career GPs feel like they're being prepared for the job that existed 10 to 20 years ago, rather than the job that exists today, rather than that modern day GP role. And there's a few things in there clinically, but there's also things non-clinically as well. And one of the biggest non-clinical elements of that was that of leadership and management. They told us how they now feel this is core to the role of a modern day GP. And they would even go as far as putting it alongside something like dermatology. So we don't need to all be experts in dermatology, but we do need to have a core understanding of what it is and how we do it. That was the level of importance they gave it. Does that happen in our training as things stand? No, ultimately, they felt that this was a bit of a gap. And we've had some really productive conversations locally here, but also regionally and nationally about how do we prepare our GP trainees for the job that exists today rather than the one of 20 years ago. And leadership and management is really a key component of that.
And just to highlight though, as we're speaking on behalf of all the participants within the Big GP consultation, there was a divide. Some people were interested in the leadership and management perspective and, you know, wanted to progress to becoming a partner or work in one of the ICSs. And there was a cohort that actually just wanted to simply do their clinical job and go home and didn't want to be involved in that at all. But what Liam is saying is there should be just a base level of leadership and management skills that we should be learning, and we shouldn't force it upon the trainees to go all the way and learn the full ins and outs unless they want to go down that route. Like for myself and Liam, we like leadership management, so we took a fellowship year specifically around leadership and management to develop and hone those skills. But it was also mentioned that general practice must be sufficiently represented at all levels of the ICS decision-making architecture to represent the views of the diverse geography. And there was apprehension amongst the participants that in the current climate of the clinical pressures and GPs not directly being employed in ICSs, this may not happen, and it could lead to an us and them scenario with secondary care. So the size and the scale of the ICS could really mean that a single GP representative may not be able to effectively represent the views of a diverse geography. So that was one of the things that was mentioned by our participants.
It's definitely a challenge when you talk about representation, because things go bigger, then smaller, then bigger, then smaller, and we go through those cycles. And you're right, they're trying to get the views of, you know, the breadth of general practice, and we know how challenging that can be. To represent a smaller or a larger area can be truly challenging at times. Just sticking a little bit with the whole leadership concept, one of the things that obviously has come out of the past few years with PCNs in particular is the concept of supervision. And you kind of touched on this with the team aspect of things. I mean, supervision is a great part of general practice training. You are with your trainer for obviously the final year in particular, throughout that whole kind of apprenticeship type of model and stuff. Supervision with the additional roles is obviously a key part that we're seeing having real benefit and stuff. Was there anything that came out in terms of trainees understanding and wanting to know about the whole supervision of other members of the team? Because that's got to be an unusual experience to go from being supervised to then suddenly being the supervisee, I guess, or supervisor. Sorry, well, I'm getting my you know what
I know exactly what you mean, and that again has been another a really key theme coming about this. So we spoke already about how people are really keen to work alongside this multidisciplinary team, but the reality is we don't always understand what they do, and we don't understand the type of patients we see. We don't always understand how best to refer into them in our practice in some cases. And certainly we don't understand how best to supervise these additional roles when they do knock on the door with a prescription or they do come and ask you a question. And participants actually brought some experience from other areas. So participants who trained in the likes of emergency medicine, for example, they spoke to us about how supervision is a key part of their role. As they become more senior in emergency medicine, they're expected to supervise other members of staff. And as a result, they did receive a great deal of training in how to do so. So supervision, as you know, is a skill in and of itself in order to do it effectively. So actually, well, again, there's a bit of a gap here. We will be, each day we spend in practice as qualified GPs, be supervising some of these roles. A bit of training on how to do this supervision effectively will really go some way towards making this more efficient and effective. But then alongside the actual training in supervision, there's something about the model of supervision as well, which participants felt we don't really have right at the moment in general practice. So you might have, there are different models of supervision, right? You might have what classically happens with GP trainees and their supervisors, where the trainee will do a clinic and then knock on the door at the end of the day and debrief. Or others, you might jump in and ask questions as the clinic is going. Or in some places, we even heard of a duty doctor, for example, who would have no patients booked with them all day, but would be there as the conductor of the orchestra, supervising all of these different roles. There's kind of a feeling that in many of the practices our participants worked in, we hadn't quite got that right yet. And we weren't operating to any model at all, almost. And it was ad hoc and as a result, inefficient and ineffective. So they really spoke to us about how great it would be to have some training in the supervision, given that we'll be doing it each and every day, and also how handy it would be to almost have a menu of models that we could pick from and look to try them out in different parts of our practices to get something that works for our workforce.
And building on that, without being equipped with these skills, they felt that they were walking into a workforce feeling very unprepared. This then led to stress, then led to burnout, and people leaving completely because they're just getting stressed and all these adjuncts added to their normal everyday job. And with respect to transition to post CCT, they said, maybe it's better to move towards apprenticeship for the final 6 months, practicing the supervision, mentorship with your GP practice, different roles. There should be more post CCT support. Building on the first 5 communities was key, knowing the people around you, a bit more coaching and mentoring. So it has a knock-on effect. Building these mentorship skills and supervision skills, if you don't have it in the beginning, when you go out into the workforce, it'll lead to stress and burnout because you feel like you're just quickly, frantically trying to do that on the side.
So we're definitely going to come back to stress, burnout and well-being, because we know that's a key feature of general practice right now. But before we get there, I guess one of the absolute massive things that happened in the past couple of years, obviously COVID came along, changed general practice in the way that we deliver it, with the way we engage with it. And obviously there's been a lot of positive stuff and there's been some negative stuff that's happened. As a couple of people that have experienced the change in GP training, particularly over that time, as people have heard from those that have gone through that experience, how has the training aspect of that been with general practice? Because obviously the way that you have learned how to do general practice is completely different to my generation and the generation above me and the one above that and stuff. And I guess in particular, the concept of triage is an interesting one I'd like to raise, because that's something that may not always be taught effectively, because actually we didn't used to do that en masse. So I'm keen to know what findings that was in terms of particularly, I mean, that clearly relates to the clinical role of GPs and, you know, the practice and stuff, which I know is a key feature of the Big GP consultation. But yeah, you know, we've got remote consultations, online consultations, triage, all that kind of stuff. How did that come through in terms of the consultation?
Oh, a lot of our generation who were working during the pandemic, we learned via remote consulting, and we potentially didn't even see people face to face. It were at the very, very peak of it. So the issue with that was that the curriculum didn't change as fast as what was happening on the ground. So we were just expected to just, you know, suddenly consult. We were thinking about, is this medically, legally okay? Is this safe to do? You know, risk really was a huge topic in our practice, because we knew we couldn't see them. But we really had to ask pertinent questions on the phone, but we weren't trained in that way. We were used to examining the patients, because usually in GPST1 and GPST2, you've done your hospital placements. Again, that's all physical examinations and everything. And then doing everything literally on the phone, it was daunting, and you were worried you might miss something, and it became really scary. And now I've gone back into my head has just fallen. Now I've come back into GPST3. I'm seeing patients face to face, but it's a hybrid model. I'm seeing some telephone, I've got some video consultations, and I've got face to face. So it's a new whole learning realm for me, because I was literally trained in the pandemic during just virtual remote consulting. But the curriculum needs to change, and we need to now be equipped with the skills of how to remote consult in addition to face-to-face, because there's a whole load of risk involved with that.
Yeah, and I think participants did sort of highlight quite nicely that actually for the people who set the curriculum, it's a real challenge, because you're almost sort of shooting at a moving target in a way. As soon as you think you've got it, the target moves further. So that there is a challenge, but there was the recognition that actually if we're seeing a significant portion of our patients remotely, then specific training on the likes of e-consultations, of telephone consultations, of video consultation, that has to be a core aspect of our training. And something, again, I know you mentioned triage, Candy, and I'd maybe quite like to ask you a question on this. It's not covered within our training, or at least the training that I've had, the difference between what is a remote consultation, where you take your history, you give your management, and you wrap everything up in one consultation, between the difference between that and triage, where you get a brief bit of information from the patient, you might be duty doctor, for example, and then signpost them to the right person in the practice at the right time. We didn't go into huge detail with our participants, but what I've seen in my clinical training in the past number of years is actually, I'm not sure we quite get the difference between triage and consulting. And I see many people who sort of do full consultations, and then instead of doing the management, they'll pass that bit on to somebody else in the practice. I don't know, Gandhi, what you think about that in your experience.
Yes, so I see remote consultations as the tools, and then the method is actually, you know, how do you complete the consultation? So is it triage to signpost to another part of the system for it to be completed, or is it that you're actually completing it there, and then in which case it's not actually triage, as you said, it's remote consultation, or it's then moving to face-to-face. It's interesting, I worked in a practice in Bradford at the earlier parts of my training where they had the triage concept on a face-to-face model. So they would have 3-minute consultations with patients, initially seen by a HCA or nurse to take things like blood pressure readings, metrics, that kind of stuff. The GP would come in, and then they would signpost them to either a different part of the practice based on what they needed, or if it was really simple, clearly obvious to that experience, and it was always an experienced GP, then they would complete the consultation there and then. It was a one problem, let's deal with this quick and urgent kind of thing. So, and you know, they were consulting at 3 minutes face to face, generally speaking, 2 rooms separate. I mean, this is going back nearly, 15 years. And so when the IT was not there, we didn't have Accurix, we didn't have all these other kind of tools and that kind of stuff. But it's the same concept. It is navigating people to the different parts of the system and moving on from there. So I think it's really interesting. I think triage in particular is something that can work really well, but it does depend on how you integrate it. And also it does massively come down to the confidence of the clinician to understand how to manage it, and also the engagement of the patients. Some patients it will work really well, and some patients it definitely will not work effectively. And it's trying to find the balance between those different aspects and stuff. I guess over the past few years, we've seen crisis upon crisis in general practice, but we've also seen crises outside of general practice. We know there's definitely things like the antibiotic resistance challenge that we're facing across the entire NHS, and massively fueled, unfortunately, by the COVID because of the experience people have had, the green agenda, and also we've currently got the cost of living crisis. GPs obviously have a role in society and the environment itself. So was there anything that came through from the work that you did in terms of where we're moving forward with that possibly, and how people feel about that side of things?
Yes,
maybe
absolutely.
I touched upon, I was going to say sustainable healthcare. Liam, you can talk about health inequalities. We can split it that way. So sustainable healthcare, greener practice was another huge topic that our participants were hugely passionate about. And they wanted to all do their bit towards the 2045 net zero, and they would be happy to see more communications around that. And they said that we need to ensure the links between climate change and health and sustainable healthcare practices are taught at all levels, from medical school to GP training, all the way towards the GP trainers who are teaching us at GP BTS schemes. So it was felt that the GP should use their trusted voice as advocates for climate change and health issues, and really educate the public, for example, on reducing carbon footprint and trying avoiding exposure to air pollution, for example. So that was the greener practice side of things. And I'll hand over to Liam to speak about health inequalities, because that was another huge topic that we discussed in our report.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, something that came through really strongly, the sort of the social mindedness and the social conscience of this generation. And actually we are the pillar of our community, and we want to be, and we want to do what we can within that to tackle some of these challenges. Health inequalities being a huge one. They felt, again, this is something they're very passionate about, they're aware of, and I think there's a real recognition as well amongst our generation that the healthcare that we offer isn't necessarily the biggest factor that makes up somebody's health. There's a real sort of acceptance and understanding of the wider determinants of health, and maybe up to 80%, depending on where you read, is of somebody's health is determined by beyond the healthcare that we offer them. Mm-hmm. So there's a feeling that, again, this is a big cross-cutting theme, like climate change and our social responsibility. You might see a few recurring themes here, Gandhi, but it's the importance of understanding this better, and the importance of actually practical things that we can do in order to tackle health inequalities within our practices and PCNs. There were two things that participants spoke about really favourably. Firstly was something about equitable distribution of funding, of core funding, to practices and to PCNs. And many of them were actually aware of the emerging evidence that more money tends to go to more affluent areas, and more GPs therefore follow. And then we end up in a situation where our more deprived practices are short of staff and short of, therefore, the workforce to deliver care. And they felt that anything we tried to do tackling health inequalities, our smaller projects are almost sort of swimming upstream against this big challenge. So they did call for more equitable distribution of funding. And secondly, something I've just mentioned, sort of the social determinants of health. They're well aware of them, but they almost found it surprising that us in general practice, we don't necessarily have access to that information within, say, the clinical record. So that we know full well who our diabetic patients are or who our pregnant patients are, but we don't necessarily know whether they're financially secure, whether their housing is safe and warm, or through to things like whether they have access to green space and things like this. So when actually the recognition that if these are the real things that are determining someone's health and well-being, if we had a better understanding of them and they were available within the record, we could actually take steps to change the clinical management we offer to tailor to those needs and offer more personalised care. but also B, think about how we might better engage the likes of our social prescribers with these people who we know are facing these various disadvantages. So yeah, a real sort of call for something on that as well, as in it'd be really handy to have that information in the clinical record.
So I guess moving forward then, we've talked earlier about challenges in terms of well-being, in terms of retention and all that kind of stuff. Workforce is a key challenge in general practice. It's a problem across the entire NHS. It's a problem everywhere, let's be honest. But the understanding of that we don't have a workforce coming through to support the needs of our population and absolutely the support to our teams out there and stuff. What information, was there anything that came out of this that could be potential routes to helping tackle the workforce shortage? You know, how do we get out of this? And was there stuff that came through from your perspective that actually this might be the things we need to really consider that haven't already been talked about? I know we've got lots of stuff from our politicians and, you know, pie in the sky. Let's be honest, some of it is it's just sound bites. But yeah, anything that you felt came through strongly?
So in relation to workforce, it wasn't just recruiting new people, it was retention. Retention was a huge thing, and that's probably what we need to focus on with our policymakers, retaining our current workforce and tackling that huge burnout and the reason that people are leaving. So some of the things our participants mentioned about why they feel burned out is the workload is huge. And to tackle this, we need a flexible appointment system. With the complex conditions people are coming in with nowadays, not 10 minutes is not enough. Is it worth moving towards a 50-minute appointment? It was also mentioned having a sense of community within the practice. So some GPs mentioned they do admin tasks in communal spaces, and this was more sociable. And another thing that was touched upon was the negative media coverage. It really led to a loss of that intrinsic motivation by our GPs and our GP trainees. And it was really demoralizing to see that. A lot of the participants wanted that autonomy and that flexible working and potentially moving away from sessions to hours worked instead. These were some of the potential solutions that we discussed about resolving the burnout to try and retain our workforce. And also things about appraisals and CPDs. Right now, there's obviously pros and cons to different models, but there was a feeling of a lack of parity regarding CPD with secondary care, as they have a lot of protection time to do it. Whereas in general practice, they felt that they don't, and they kind of squeezing it in between clinic times, and it can become a huge burden. So maybe moving on to a different model or having protected time to do that.
Yeah, I think there were some really positive things that are coming out as well. We spoke specifically to trainees and earlier career GPs, and they told us things that were helpful for them at that stage of their career. A big one was fellowships. So clinical fellowships in order to develop an area of interest. Educational fellowships, leadership fellowships. They felt though that was a really good way to get a better work-life balance that would keep them in the profession for the long term. So they told us that was really helpful. But we looked to our sort of mid and later career colleagues, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of that happening. So that was almost presented by our participants as an opportunity. But actually, these fellowships are something that we feel like we benefit a lot from. Is there scope to offer those to our people in the mid and later career who might be experiencing burnout, who might be thinking about leaving the profession altogether or reducing their hours? Is there something we can do there about supporting them to develop an area of interest, particularly if that's within patient-facing roles, and has the added benefit of hopefully keeping them engaged, enthused, energized for the long term?
Definitely agree with the concept of fellowships. I know with my other hat as PC and clinical director in our patch, we've got new career GP fellowships. We've got mid-career GP fellowships. So you have to have been practicing at least 5 years before you can even apply for it and stuff. So, you know, definitely that look of support. And I guess I know I've seen many GPs using the retainee scheme as a way of, you know, keeping people towards that retirement side of things, closer towards general practice to try and maintain some aspects of workforce and stuff. I guess that raises the question of the future of what we're looking at and stuff. And a lot of the things we talked about is the career of general practice. As we look at, I guess, finishing off, what would you say is the route to a sustainable career? Is there one way, or as I suspect, there probably isn't? So what learning did we have from the GP consultation about what makes a sustainable GP career? Particularly, and I'm keen to hear about, is not necessarily practice-based solutions, but the wider sphere of it, in particular, the bigger picture, shall we say?
Well, that's a great question, Gandhi. And all the insight that we've gained via this Big GP consultation, the ideas we've shared are relevant to all levels of the system. And we've actually shared all of these findings at national level during conversations with the various organisations from RCGP, HEE, and England, everywhere. And then the ideas have also been taken on board more locally too during conversations with our local medical committees, training hubs, integrated care boards. We've presented sort of the findings from all the next generation to conferences like RCGP Wonka, ASME. We've fed into the fuller report. And we really hope that all of this work will provide an important piece of the puzzle to inform the future policy development. And this work has thrown up so much tangible ideas that you can implement in your own practice, PCN, and system. And that's why we actually developed a toolkit. And I'll probably hand over to Liam, so he can tell you more about that toolkit on how you can, implement stuff at practice level.
There's some very practical stuff that people can take away from today. And before I come to that, I just want to come back to Candy's question, because it was so good on how are we going to make this a sustainable career in the long term? If there was one idea that we could stick on a poster and say, this is how we're going to do it, and everyone needs to get behind this, I think ultimately we know that would have already happened, and we would be working towards that. And we didn't. The challenges are such that I don't believe that there is one silver bullet that will solve all of this. That's not as sort of attractive to say, and it doesn't make great policy headlines. But I think the reality, what we heard from participants, is that it's shifting the dial with lots of sort of cumulative efforts around all of those things that Davina spoke around. It's around giving people autonomy and flexible working for them to create a career that works for them and is sustainable. It's about developing that sense of community, and how can we do that within and beyond our practices. And it's about making sure we've got the offer right in terms of training the GPs for the job that exists today rather than the job that existed 20 years ago, and making sure that wraparound support is in place, that coaching, that mentoring, that building first 5 networks, mid-career networks, that we know participants tell us is so helpful. So I would love to have given you the answer on a postcard, and that's it. We've sorted it. But it's probably no surprise that there's a few things and a few areas where we need to be sort of put in focus in order to overcome this challenge.
So Davina mentioned it as well. What is this toolkit I keep hearing about? And walk us through that briefly.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for the prompt. So the Big GP Toolkit, what this is, we had so many actionable ideas from our participants about things that we could take forward at practice and at PCN level. So let me give you an example. They said, well, we want to work multidisciplinary, but we don't necessarily know the roles of the people we work alongside, how to refer into them, what types of patients they do and don't see. That's something that's very different between different practices and different PCNs, and is therefore best tackled at that level. And we also know alongside this that GP trainees, first 5 GPs, etc., have requirements nowadays to do leadership activities and to think about things like quality improvement. What we wanted to do was to give back to our participants and to our general practice workforce and say, these are some of the big ideas. These are some very tangible things that you can do in your practice, and here are the things that will support you to do so. So on the multidisciplinary working idea, it's saying, well, we all have practice meetings, we all have PCN meetings. Why don't you think about setting aside 15 minutes in a practice meeting once a month and bring each role in and ask them to talk about who they are, what they do, and how we can best work alongside them. And in order to get this rolling, the toolkit has things like emails you might want to send to your partner or your practice manager, just floating the idea. It has a set of template slides that you might want to use as a practice and put your stamp on and get our social prescribers on, our pharmacists to fill them out and present, etc. So that's one of the ideas. The other idea is to tackle some of the big things that you've mentioned about how do we work with our training hubs in our area to improve leadership and management training. What does tackling health inequalities look like in practice, and what steps can I, as a GP trainee or a first 5 GP, take in order to think about how our practices do some of this? So I think I would really recommend, of course, taking a look at that toolkit on the website and having a look at those 5 big, key, high impact actions that everybody could, in a supported way, take away from today, alongside everything else we have to do, of course.
So where do people go to get that toolkit and stuff? So the hub that contains everything is, as we've had on screen, www.thebiggpconsultation.co.uk. And on that, you can find a whole host of things. So you can find our final report in its entirety. You can find the deeper dive reports into each of the sessions that we've done. You can find short summary videos if you've only got a few minutes. And we've got a summary video of each of our main sections of the report that are just 2 minutes long to give you a flavour of what was discussed. And also you can find the toolkit as well. And that's something you can download, you can take away, you can have a look through, and you can access all of the resources within that as well.
You can follow us on social media. We have a Twitter at Big GP Consult, where we usually post a lot of our videos or infographics and put a lot of updates on there as well.
And we'll be sharing the recording of this podcast as soon as it's available.
And I think it's really important to know that this definitely, to me, sounds like it's a process. You know, it's not a case of the project's done and we've done a bit of work and it will go to the green grass and that kind of stuff. Sorry, George Reza going through my head just then, green grass and stuff. But I think it's really important that we see how this progresses and moves forward and stuff. And definitely I can see some of that from the comments that we're having. So, I mean, if we go through these, JC, our #1 fan, absolutely loving the sessions, of great questions and quality answers, fabulous explanations, and thanks. I think there's something about you. Yeah, you guys deserve medals for the work that you've been doing and stuff in terms of the content and things. But absolutely, I think, you know, the toolkit to me sounds like a really impressive tool to use in practice, you know, whether that's practice teams, AITs in particular. I think there's lots of stuff, like you said, that may help with training and stuff. And I know we're going to be covering that side of things for the GP consultation in more detail when we cover the Innovate podcast that's going to be in 2 weeks' time. So if you are watching or listening to this and you want to hear that more focused stuff around GP trainees and how this applies to them, definitely jump in and join us for that. And you'll be seeing a video version of that coming up somewhere here or something like that, possibly at this point. Davina, Liam, thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed this, learning about the Big GP consultation. And absolutely, if people do want to check it out, as we've said already a few times today, go to the website, the homepage and stuff, the biggGPconsultation.co.uk. Lots of information and video stuff. I'm a big fan of people creating video things to help. It makes life easier. So thank you for that. Absolutely. And as always,
you're very welcome.
No problems. As always, if anyone does have questions, let us know. Stick it in the chat and stuff down below. We'll come back to it and things. And you know what? We're here to help tech enhance your primary care and learning. I'll catch you next time. See you later.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.